Yes, the video title will include other things, but we're going to discuss facts, math, and stuff that you're not allowed to argue unless you can prove through experiment that I'm wrong. In various mediums, light travels at various speeds, either through propagation of one type or another, or being interfered with by the material. In a vacuum, in intergalactic space, and or between the Earth and the Moon, the speed is about the same, and we call it a refractive index of 1 at 300,000 kilometers per second. The numbers after this point will be in 100,000 kilometers per second. At 230, we have the refractive index of 1.2, and that's the speed of light or radio propagation or electromagnetic waveforms in copper, as well as DC speed of light, too. That's 62 to 95% of the speed of light in various materials, but coppers in this case, and also down to 1% of the speed of light. 3,000 kilometers a second, depending on the material. 225,000 kilometers per second in water, refractive index 1.3. Refractive index 1.5 is for glass, and that's at 200,000 kilometers per second. That's at 66% of the speed of light. The speed of light in an antenna we're going to call as an average because of the various materials and the air around it and all the other characteristics, 80% of the speed of light compared to a vacuum. The length of an antenna will be close to the wavelength in a classic antenna for the signal. Higher frequencies use shorter wavelengths and are a smaller antenna. You can make it bigger, but you usually are making it smaller. The wavelength at 60 gigahertz is half a centimeter, 5 millimeters. It is not millimeter wavelength. That is a marketing bullshit jargon thing. And yes, I know, radio signal data files a long time back called it millimeter wave. It's 5 millimeter wave or half centimeter, but we can call it millimeter because you need to, because you're trying to avoid saying centimeter. It's 1/4 inch wavelength around that. It's 1 centimeter at 30 gigahertz. Dipoles are the most common wire antenna in classic usage. Their length is equal to half the wavelength, and a simple antenna is usually half wavelength long and split at the exact center for the connection for the input or output feed. You can make them much smaller or have a wider frequency range, usually both, for an antenna for send and receive by increasing the complexity. This includes making snowflake or fractal antennas. That's what you have inside of your cell phone. Instead of a wire antenna of a specific length, you have a grid postage stamp looking thing that does a strange pattern that tries to catch every frequency at once. This means that it loses something in the process, but it does become omnidirectional. The carrier for these radio signals, whether they be DC, electric current flowing, light, whatever. In metals, it's the electrons acting as the main carrier. Yes, there's a Veritasium video recently that talks about some other damn thing. I don't give a shit. We're talking about what we can actually show. In organic tissue, it isn't the electrons specifically in a metal, which is a pure metal. We're talking about compounds because you're not strictly made out of carbon or oxygen or hydrogen. You're a hydrocarbon. Much different than oil, but still hydrocarbon. And organic tissue, the ions between each element in the molecules, which are much larger, are responsible for the transmission and or conduction or propagation of electrical charges and or radio signals. Obviously, being larger and more complex, this is slower and has a different wavelength. But because it's more complex, it has less likelihood of being a wavelength or any wavelength that you can work with, and the efficiency of deciding that you're going to use radio signals to affect tissue or pick up radio signals drops by massive orders of magnitude. With metals like copper or aluminum, the radio signal loss is, we're just going to call it arbitrarily, you lose 2%. In tissue, you lose 99%. The energy is dispersed in ways that have no effect on anything and simply end up being lost wandering through the materials. At higher frequencies, this effect is so extreme that radio signals at or near what you're using for a cell phone, even old school analog, can't go more than 1 millimeter deep into the tissue before it's blocked entirely, to where the radio signal can't be detected even by cranking up the amplification. If you put a receiver in your mouth, you can't pick up the signal from some of the older signal sources, unless it's really, really jacked up and then or brought really, really close so you'd have very little loss. And higher frequencies have less likelihood of going through the skin. And at super high frequencies, they can't even enter the skin, like around 20 gigahertz. At 2.4 gigahertz, the wavelength is 12.5 centimeters, but the depth of it going in is much, much less, like very, very little, on the order of, let's say, 1 millimeter. That's 100 to 1 reduction in depth based on frequency. Higher frequencies don't go deeper, they don't go as deep until you hit a certain set of frequencies where it can actually conduct through molecules, not by going through the molecules, but by the atoms, by being very low, very, very short wavelengths and very high frequencies, like an X-ray. The radio signal, if you want to call it that at this point, is higher frequency and shorter wavelength than light. Light can't go through you. Can you see me? No. That blocks the radio signal or light. But at extreme high frequencies like X-rays, it can go right through. You and I are just see-through, ugly, icky thingies to an X-ray machine. But at low frequency, it also can't get through and cause damage. Now, depending on the frequencies, a signal can conduct through, but it's not a wavelength that can harm you. A wavelength this long isn't the same length as your DNA. Yes, I know DNA, if you string it out, is very long, but that's not how it's stored in a cell, now is it? No, it doesn't magically bend the radio signal so you can say it affects DNA. Radio signals, no matter what frequency you're working with, aren't able to break DNA, alter oxygen, or do any of this. But 60 gigahertz isn't the wavelength of an oxygen atom. It isn't. It's a frequency that has an effect on oxygen. No, the oxygen blocks it because it makes it opaque. The radio signals don't harm oxygen or any other gases in the air. The radio signals are destroyed by the oxygen atoms that do nothing. Just like your body can block the camera, that doesn't mean the camera is being able to hurt me. It means I'm blocking the camera and I can defeat it. Air defeats 60 gigahertz. If you don't like these answers, I don't give a shit. This is something you can demonstrate at a college. Pick up a book. Radio signals at low and high frequencies have been found not to affect human flesh because they have been found not to affect human flesh, animals, and most plants and bugs. Some of them are affected by very, very specific and very strange conditions, usually involving jacking the wattage way up or having direct contact, not a radio signal, at 2 watts or less. It's usually a couple of milliwatts. None of the arguments about radio signals affecting human beings, whether you invoke 5G, magical terminology like millimeter wavelength, or whatever, can do any of this. The only signals that can do these things are ionizing radiation, very high frequencies, or chunks of atoms being blown off, like neutrons, protons, electrons, whatever, or gamma rays, or X-rays. Deciding otherwise is lying. It's just, that's it, you're lying to yourself. And half a centimeter isn't a nanometer. Next, L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology plagiarized a 1934 German book called Scientology, among hundreds of other subjects. Good artists steal. He was writing sci-fi novels. It became a religion. One of the components in Scientology is that you tell people that they're going to be persecuted for being part of the group, and then tell them to do things, dog whistles, that make it to where people recognize that in them, so they'll be persecuted. And that's a test, or a sociopath fucking with people, or just trolling. The other part of it is, they tell them to do these dog whistles by saying shit that is completely contrarian to reality. Up is down, left is right, the world is flat, whatever, and then you put a chip on your shoulder, and then act like you don't have a chip on your shoulder. Next, 1930s, Wallace D. Fard plagiarized maybe even that book, but other books that came before, and various belief systems. Many, I call them pseudo-religions, many cults do that. Wallace D. Fard is the origin story and person who started the Nation of Islam, which is not a Muslim organization. It's patterned and imitating Islam. This is an organization that tells people to do and say things and believe things that are contrary to reality and don't make any sense, just like every other religion. It's a way to prove you're part of the group. It's a dog whistle. It's also, more importantly, a rite of passage for you to go around and tell people, if you're a part of the Church of Scientology, I believe in a great space demon that encapsulated all of the evil forces in the world into people as engrams or something. And in the case of the Nation of Islam, there is a origin story of an evil scientist who created white people to torment black people. And that is not an oversimplification. That is literally what they teach. No, this isn't bigotry, and this isn't racism. This is me explaining that this is the cockamamie bullshit story from two separate groups that have almost identical plagiarism patterns that tell people to say and do things that make them into a target so they can have a self-fulfilling prophecy of being persecuted. Suddenly you're being persecuted by going on Twitter by citing Nation of Islam mythology that is contrary to reality and just makes it look like you're part of a cult. Now, the final step here. What has this got to do with 5G? Some guy who's a member of the Nation of Islam, at least that's what he espoused, made a video and put it on YouTube saying all sorts of crazy shit and saying if you argue with me, you're an evil white devil created by Yaqub, that's actually the creature, and you're an Edomite. This is another thing that's been tacked on. Edomite is a code word for dirty white person who deserves to die. No, that's not an oversimplification either. And I got a bunch of comments in December 2020 about all of the shit I just described to you. And they called me an Edomite. A filthy Edomite and a red Edomite and a twit. So I made a video with that in the title along with everything else I've covered here. Now, a famous actress named Letitia Wright reposted that video that guy put up. And I'm stating that guy, who I'm not naming, is a bigot. He hates white people. He calls people Edomite. Or not. But the point is, he brought up a whole bunch of crazy shit. Again, you're part of a cult where everybody says shit that is not reality-based, and you all paint yourself as being persecuted, so when someone tells you you made a mistake by not knowing the wavelength of light, that's persecution. Anyway, Letitia Wright reposted this video and perpetuated conspiracy theories about medicine, radio signals, reality, history, the shape of the planet, for all I know. But the point is, that was also in the title. And that video touched on vaccines and COVID. Now we're at the part where I might have to cut out that mention. YouTube flagged the video I made because I said those words in a sentence. I was fighting medical misinformation, and I've been flagged for perpetuating it. She was flagged for perpetuating it. That video that guy put up on YouTube was flagged for perpetuating it. And everybody screamed, I'm being persecuted because I'm black or something, while screaming that they wanted, in some cases, not hers, that they wanted to kill all the white people because white people were invented by Yaqub to persecute black people. I'm not shitting you. That's the Nation of Islam's basis. And just like the Church of Scientology lying about their space opera, they'll lie about it too until you get into it a little bit. Now, are everybody in the Church of Scientology like that? No. All the free zone people aren't. Is everybody in the Nation of Islam like this? No. The reasonable ones don't even listen to this shit. But she reposted that video, and that was what that video was about. And I had to go through this complicated explanation for it. Thank you. Have a good day. Good luck with all that.